Rome liked to imagine itself as a city of laws. Marble tablets, sacred oaths, and solemn rituals promised order in a world that feared chaos. To be Roman was to believe that discipline separated civilization from savagery. Yet somewhere along the path from republic to empire, that belief fractured. Power did not merely bend the law, it hollowed it out, wore its skin, and learned how to speak with its voice. This story is not about madness in the obvious sense, not frothing tyrants screaming at shadows. It is about a quieter, more dangerous transformation, when cruelty became reasonable, when humiliation was framed as justice, and when obedience mattered more than truth. Rome did not fall into brutality overnight. It trained itself carefully, step by step, until cruelty felt normal and mercy felt suspicious. Emperors discovered that fear was more reliable than loyalty. Officials learned that survival depended on participation. Soldiers were taught that restraint was weakness. Priests rebranded suffering as sacred duty, and the law, once meant to protect, became the most efficient weapon of all. Every punishment was justified, every excess recorded, every atrocity explained as necessary. The terrifying truth is this: Rome did not collapse because its rulers went mad. Rome collapsed because madness learned how to govern. When power replaced sanity, cruelty stopped being a personal failing and became a legal standard. And once that happened, no one inside the system was truly innocent. This is the story of how Rome crossed that line and why it could never return. Rome's descent into legalized cruelty did not begin with screams. It began with paperwork. In the early empire, the machinery of power still wore the familiar robes of republican virtue. Laws were debated, decrees were announced with ceremonial gravity, and punishments were justified as necessary corrections to disorder. Yet, beneath this polished surface, something subtle shifted. Authority stopped asking whether an action was just and began asking only whether it was effective. The first victims were not rebels or enemies, but norms. Senators learned that disagreement was no longer a political position, it was a personal risk. Trials became performances where verdicts were decided before testimony was heard. Accusations did not need proof, they needed usefulness. A charge that removed a rival, silenced a critic, or enriched the treasury was considered sufficient. Emperors quickly realized that fear worked best when it felt inevitable rather than explosive. Public executions were carefully staged, not merely to punish the condemned, but to instruct the living. The message was precise. The law sees everything, remembers everything, and forgives nothing. Crowds were encouraged to attend, to watch, and eventually to enjoy. Spectacle turned participation into complicity. What made Rome's system uniquely dangerous was not its violence, but its order. Cruelty was organized into ranks, offices, and procedures. A man could lose his property by decree, his family by accusation, and his life by protocol, all without a single raised voice. The calmness of the process stripped victims of the illusion that mercy might appear at the last moment. Officials who carried out these measures rarely considered themselves monsters. They were clerks, magistrates, soldiers following instructions. Each step of the process was small enough to feel reasonable. A signature here, a guard posted there, a sentence carried out because the document said so. Responsibility dissolved into bureaucracy. The emperors encouraged this diffusion deliberately. By making cruelty a collective act, no single hand held the knife. When everyone participated, no one could protest without indicting themselves. Silence became the safest response, and silence soon felt like consent. Even religion was folded into the structure. Priests declared obedience a sacred duty. Disloyalty was reframed as impiety. To resist the emperor was to offend the gods, who, conveniently, always seemed to favor the ruler in power. Rituals, once meant to purify the city, now sanctified punishment. Suffering acquired a divine justification. Soldiers were trained not only to fight, but to suppress hesitation. Compassion was portrayed as a weakness that endangered order. Recruits learned that restraint invited suspicion, while enthusiasm earned reward. Over time, brutality became a career advantage. Promotions followed those who enforced commands without question. The people, watching from below, adapted quickly. They learned what expressions to wear in public, when to applaud, when to look away, when to pretend not to recognize a neighbor being led away. Survival depended on reading the invisible rules of fear. The city did not need constant terror, it needed consistency, and Rome provided it. By the time open madness appeared in certain rulers, the groundwork was already laid. The institutions no longer existed to restrain excess, they existed to execute it efficiently. When emperors demanded more, harsher punishments, deeper humiliations, broader authority, the system did not resist, it expanded to meet the request. This was how power replaced sanity in Rome, not through sudden collapse, but through careful design. Cruelty became predictable. Predictability became law, and law, once stripped of conscience, became the most dangerous instrument Rome ever created.
Once the structure was in place, Rome no longer required stable rulers. It required only a body to occupy the throne. The transformation was subtle but decisive. Earlier emperors had relied on precedent, tradition, and the illusion of restraint. But as generations passed, the position itself began to warp the men who held it. Absolute power did not merely corrupt, it isolated. Emperors stopped receiving truth and began receiving echoes. What courtiers thought they wanted to hear filtered through fear. Suspicion became the defining emotion of imperial rule. A laugh in the Senate might signal mockery. A delay in applause could suggest treason. Even silence became dangerous, as it left room for interpretation. Rulers learned to read threat into neutrality, and once that happened, cruelty felt like self-defense. The emperor's word, once a directive, hardened into something final. Legal scholars rewrote doctrine to match imperial desire. What pleased the ruler was lawful. What disturbed him was criminal. Justice was no longer blind, it watched the emperor's face for cues. This shift produced a new kind of madness, one that hid behind procedure. Executions were justified with elegant language. Confiscations were framed as moral corrections. Entire families vanished, not because of proven guilt, but because their continued existence made the ruler uncomfortable. Memory itself became suspect. Names were erased from inscriptions. Faces were chiseled off statues. History was edited in stone. Humiliation became a favorite instrument. Death ended fear too quickly. Shame lingered. Senators were forced to beg publicly for their lives. Generals were stripped of honors in front of their own troops. Widows were compelled to thank the emperor for sparing their children after he had destroyed their husbands. Power discovered that breaking dignity was often more effective than spilling blood. Sexual domination, too, became a language of control, not as indulgence alone, but as policy. Intimacy was weaponized to degrade rivals and bind families into silence. What happened behind palace walls was whispered in the city, not for scandal, but for warning. Everyone understood the message. Even the most private boundaries were no longer protected by status or law. The emperor's inner circle adapted accordingly. Advisors learned to anticipate cruelty before it was spoken. They competed to offer harsher solutions, framing them as loyalty. Mercy began to look suspicious, even subversive. To suggest restraint was to imply weakness in the ruler, and that implication could be fatal. Soldiers tasked with enforcing these decisions underwent their own transformation. At first, many struggled, but repeated exposure dulled resistance. Violence became routine. Orders became easier to follow when victims were reduced to categories: traitor, offender, impure, expendable. Language did the work before the blade ever moved. The people absorbed these changes with grim pragmatism. Survival required emotional withdrawal. Empathy was dangerous. Attachment created leverage. Neighbors learned not to ask questions. Families taught children when not to speak. Fear did not need to shout, it only needed to remain consistent. Some emperors crossed the final threshold openly. They demanded worship, not allegiance. They staged punishments as theater, inserting themselves into the spectacle. Laughter, applause, participation, these became tests of loyalty. Refusal was noted. Hesitation was remembered. By then, the system no longer depended on the emperor's sanity. Even when paranoia slid into delusion, the state functioned smoothly. Orders were written, seals were stamped, death arrived on schedule. Rome had built a machine that could translate madness into policy without interruption. This was the most terrifying achievement of imperial Rome. It did not merely endure insane rulers, it empowered them, it refined their impulses into enforceable law. And once cruelty had proven effective, there was no incentive to abandon it. The throne no longer elevated men, it consumed them, and then continued without them.
Cruelty does not survive on authority alone. It requires witnesses. As Rome's rulers pushed further into excess, the city's population underwent its own transformation. Fear reshaped behavior.
but spectacle reshaped desire. Punishment moved from necessity to performance, and the public learned its role with unsettling speed. Executions were no longer hidden affairs. They were scheduled, advertised, and staged in places meant for entertainment. Amphitheaters, once reserved for contests of skill, became venues for humiliation and death. The condemned were dressed, named, and paraded so that no one could miss the lesson. The crime mattered less than the demonstration. Order demanded visibility. At first, crowds watched in silence. Then they reacted. Then they began to anticipate. Vendors sold food. Bets were placed on outcomes. Children were lifted onto shoulders for a better view. Horror dulled into routine, and routine into expectation. When punishment followed a predictable rhythm, it became part of civic life. The state understood this instinctively. Participation was encouraged. Applause marked loyalty. Laughter signaled safety. Those who looked away too often attracted attention. In time, spectators learned to exaggerate their reactions, to perform approval as convincingly as possible. Public emotion became a skill for survival. This complicity changed how violence was perceived. Suffering, repeated often enough, lost its individuality. Victims blurred into roles: criminal, traitor, impure, enemy of order. Once stripped of personal identity, their pain became abstract, acceptable, even necessary. Rome did not need to convince its people that cruelty was good. It only needed to convince them it was normal. Religious leaders reinforced this normalization. Punishments were framed as purification. Pain was explained as correction. Death was presented as restoration of cosmic balance. Ritual language wrapped brutality and familiarity, making resistance feel sacrilegious rather than moral. When cruelty wore sacred symbols, doubt felt like blasphemy. Even art adapted. Poets softened descriptions. Sculptors idealized scenes of domination. Reliefs carved into stone showed emperors towering above defeated figures, their posture calm, their faces serene. Violence was aestheticized, transformed into something orderly and dignified. Beauty became a shield that made horror easier to consume. Meanwhile, those closest to power competed for favor by amplifying excess. Officials proposed harsher penalties to demonstrate loyalty. Generals staged ruthless reprisals to secure promotions. Governors exceeded expectations, understanding that restraint could be interpreted as disobedience. In this environment, escalation was rational. The army played a central role. Soldiers were rotated through public enforcement duties, ensuring that the boundary between battlefield and city dissolved. War behavior followed them home. Discipline emphasized obedience over judgment. A command executed without hesitation was praised. A question asked was remembered. Over time, even resistance began to change shape. Open rebellion became rare, not because dissent vanished, but because it learned to hide. Grievances turned inward. People adapted by shrinking their moral horizons. It became safer to worry only about one's household, one's survival, one's silence. The empire did not need universal belief, only universal caution. The most effective tool was uncertainty. Laws were applied unevenly. Mercy appeared arbitrarily. No one could predict when punishment would fall. This unpredictability kept fear fresh. Hope itself became dangerous as it encouraged risk. Better to expect the worst and be relieved when it did not arrive.
In such a climate, madness at the top no longer shocked, it felt consistent with the world people inhabited. When emperors demanded ever more extravagant displays of submission, the crowd complied, because refusal carried consequences and participation offered brief relief. The system rewarded those who played along. Rome did not collapse under this weight, it endured. And that endurance was the tragedy. The city learned to function without conscience, to operate with a hollow efficiency that kept markets open and roads patrolled, while dignity eroded quietly. By the time voices began to whisper that something had gone terribly wrong, they were drowned out by cheers. The crowd had learned to watch, and in watching, it had learned to accept.
The most dangerous aspect of Rome's descent was not the cruelty itself, but what survived after the rulers were gone. Emperors were assassinated, poisoned, erased from statues and coins. Names were chiseled out of stone. Official memory pretended these figures had never existed. But systems outlived individuals, and Rome had perfected systems of fear, humiliation, and obedience that no single death could undo. When a tyrant fell, relief spread briefly through the city. People whispered again. Laughter returned to banquets. Senators spoke more freely for a while. Then the old habits resurfaced. The courts still rewarded loyalty over justice. The army still obeyed orders without question. The crowd still gathered when punishment was announced. What had been learned could not be unlearned. Rome had discovered something profoundly effective. Terror did not need constant violence. Once fear was internalized, it governed behavior on its own. Citizens began to police themselves. Families taught children when to remain silent. Friends learned which topics to avoid. Survival depended less on belief and more on instinct. Even rulers who intended restraint found themselves trapped by expectation. Mercy was interpreted as weakness. Leniency invited conspiracies. A leader who did not punish dramatically was assumed to be temporary. In this way, cruelty became institutional momentum. To rule Rome meant inheriting not just power, but the logic of domination. The Senate, once envisioned as a balance against tyranny, had been reshaped by decades of humiliation. Its members were skilled at compliance, not resistance. They debated details, not direction. Laws were crafted to appear orderly while serving arbitrary power. Procedure became camouflage for injustice. Religion, too, bore scars. Sacred authority had been bent to legitimize suffering for so long that moral language lost clarity. When pain had been framed as purification and obedience as virtue, it became difficult to distinguish faith from submission. Even sincere belief was vulnerable to manipulation. The people carried quieter wounds. Generations grew up watching cruelty normalized. Children learned early that bodies could be used as messages, that dignity was conditional, that silence was often safer than truth. These lessons shaped relationships, trust, and identity long after the spectacles ended. Rome's administrators exported these methods across the empire. Provincial governors mimicked what they had seen in the capital.
Public humiliation replaced negotiation. Exemplary punishment replaced governance. The empire functioned, but at the cost of empathy. Efficiency replaced humanity. Historians later argued about madness. They asked whether emperors were insane or merely amoral. But this question missed the point. What mattered was not the mental state of rulers, but the environment that rewarded excess. Power, unchecked and ritualized, does not require insanity to become destructive. It only requires permission. Rome did not fall because of cruelty alone. It endured for centuries afterward. But something essential had been altered. Trust between ruler and ruled eroded. Authority became synonymous with fear rather than protection. Loyalty was extracted, not earned. Over time, this hollowed the foundations of the state. When later crises arrived, economic strain, external invasions, internal division, the empire lacked resilience. People obeyed, but they did not believe. They complied, but they did not defend. A society trained to survive by submission struggles to mobilize for shared purpose. The lesson Rome leaves behind is unsettling precisely because it feels familiar. Absolute power does not always announce itself with chaos. Often it arrives wrapped in order, tradition, and legality. It replaces morality slowly, replacing conscience with routine. Cruelty becomes policy. Humiliation becomes entertainment. Silence becomes wisdom. Rome's rulers who replaced sanity with power did not invent these mechanisms, but they refined them with terrifying clarity. They showed how easily institutions could be turned inward, how quickly people adapt, and how dangerous endurance can be when it lacks resistance. The city that once believed itself eternal discovered a different kind of permanence, the long shadow cast by normalized abuse. Long after the blood was washed from marble floors, the habits remained, and in those habits the true legacy of Rome's madness endured.